My word is Castro, spelt C-A-S-T-R-O. It's not a word so much as a name, and it's a name that has a certain cachet, a certain iconic power. Not only is it the name of the current president of Cuba, Raúl Castro, president since 2008, but more importantly, because that's how people know it better, it's the name of his brother, who was the preceding president of Cuba, Fidel Castro. President from 1976 until 2008, until he stood down. But even before that, from 1959, the effective leader of Cuba, even before he became president. And most people know him either as Fidel, by and large, those who sympathize with him or have some sort of, he has some sort of attraction for them, Fidel. Mostly, if you don't like him, it's Castro. And the neutrals tend to know him as Castro, maybe Fidel Castro. So it's certainly a name that everybody associates with him and with Cuba. That's quite clear. I mean, basically, if you look at the time he's led Cuba, it is effectively 5 decades. That means he's outlasted actually 10 US presidents, all of whom tried to get rid of him at some stage or another, sometimes actually trying to get rid of him by nefarious means, by assassination attempts and so on, but certainly all wishing him gone. He's outlived them all. And also because, of course, he was at the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Even though the Cuban Missile Crisis actually was between the United States and the Soviet Union, he, of course, was the person who was leading the revolution that basically was the focal point of the crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, in a sense, quite simple. It was that in the previous year, 1961, the United States government had empowered the CIA to organize an invasion of Cuba by exiles, by Cuban exiles. It failed, but the threat of invasion was still there. And so when the Soviet Union saw an opportunity, Soviet Union was by then allied with Cuba in all sorts of ways, and they saw an opportunity to protect Cuba by placing missiles, nuclear missiles in Cuba. That's what happened, of course. And then the following October, in October 1962, the crisis blew up when the missiles were discovered. And of course, as we know, 13 days the world held its breath while the two superpowers argued it out. And in the end, the Soviet Union gave in, stood down, removed the missiles. But interestingly, Fidel Castro refused to allow inspectors into Cuba because the missiles had been removed without his permission. So that, in a nutshell, is the missile crisis. Fidel Castro has been a focal point for American policy, a hate figure, really, in the United States, clearly among Cuban Americans. That's absolutely clear. There's a particular 2 or 3 generations of Cuban Americans for whom he is not quite the devil incarnate, but certainly a major hate figure. You can see the logic of that. Most of them who are abroad in Miami, for example, lost property. Many of them disagreed with the way the revolution went. There's a logic there. The arguments about, well, not just Fidel Castro, but about the revolution as a whole are, in essence, quite simple. That is to say, the ones who oppose the revolution and for whom Fidel Castro is very much the problem, or has been very much the problem, by and large saw the revolution as either a betrayal. There was a revolution which was pretty much a nationalist, left-of-center revolution in 1959, moved very rapidly towards communism, towards an alliance with the Soviet Union, and many people saw that as a betrayal. Many of those left Cuba. The other argument against him is that once they moved towards a particular kind of revolution and a definition, the way I would put it is Cuba wasn't a fun place to be for anybody who actively opposed that direction. On the other side, of course, are those who say that the revolution actually improved Cuba socially in all sorts of ways, in education, in health, in equality. Those who say he stood up to the United States. Interestingly, Fidel Castro has a great deal of sympathy and support in Latin America from many people who do not sympathize with the politics, but simply sympathize with the fact that he stood up repeatedly to the United States. The other argument in favor of him and of the revolution would be that it actually made Cuba a player on the world stage. So those in a nutshell are the two arguments. And clearly there is no middle ground. You either like him and admire what he did, or alternatively, you cannot stand him and oppose what he did.
Okay, I have to ask now, how do you feel?
I'm an academic. I don't take positions on it. There are pluses and minuses. You can see things that worked, you can see things that didn't work. My job is always to explain, not to take sides. It was fairly clear in mid-2000s that something was wrong with Castro. He was looking ill, sounding frail. He fainted on one occasion publicly. It was obvious there was something not quite right. So it was no great surprise in 2006 when he suddenly announced, and he announced it, that he was standing down to have a major operation. What happened astonishingly there was he recovered. He actually has recovered quite substantially, not enough to run Cuba, not enough to have a very active political life, but enough to receive visitors constantly, enough to put out statements almost daily in the press about some aspect of world politics. So he's clearly still very active, and I think has surprised a lot of people by the vigour. And he's well into his 80s now. One of the problems that Cuba specialists face with the longevity of Fidel Castro is, first of all, you're always being asked about the succession. And repeatedly over the years, anybody you might have identified as a likely successor, apart from his brother, who was the obvious one, of course, inevitably just fell by the wayside. They either retired, or alternatively, something happened to them. They just simply faded from view. The other one, of course, is that I must have done now at least 3 obituaries. That's to say, been filmed in 3 obituaries. Each time he survives another 5-10 years, they have to redo it. And so I must have done that 3 times already, and I suspect I'll still do another one. Personally, I have never met him. I've seen him speak at May Day rallies, along with roughly 1 million other people, and seen him in all sorts of public performances, but no, I've never met him.
But tell me what that's like. What's it like to see him? What's the experience like?
It is an experience to watch him speak, because the thing he is most famous for actually is his long, long speeches. I mean, 7 hours. He has actually spoken for 7 hours on a couple of occasions. Mostly they're not that long. They're an hour or so. And the speeches that I've seen him give have been about an hour. Quite astonishing. He sustains an enormous wealth of detail. He just spews out statistics galore without evidently having a paper in front of him. I have to say most people actually have not necessarily listened to all the words that he's said. And that's the nature of the May Day rally in Cuba, is that people are there, not quite having a picnic, but they're there chatting to each other. They're out for a day out, but recognizing when to cheer and how to cheer, and actually, by and large, listening to something of what he's saying. No one can really listen for an hour. The other thing that Fidel Castro was always famous for most of the period when he was president, was for dressing in fatigues, in olive green fatigues. And that is quite simply because that was the colour of the rebel army, the guerrillas of 1958 to 59, 56 to 59. And therefore it became the standard colour associated and the standard dress associated with the revolution itself, with the insurrection. And so by wearing fatigues, by going around in effectively a guerrilla uniform, he was making a point that this is where it all started, and that Cuba was ready for the next invasion or ready to act on the world stage in some means or other. In fact, when he dressed in a suit, it looked strange. It looked as though almost it didn't fit him. Well, given his size, actually, that was quite likely. But at the same time, you got used to him wearing fatigues. You got used to him as a guerrilla leader, not a military leader in quite the same way, because it was clearly identified with a very unorthodox guerrilla army. Fidel Castro's private life was for a long, long time the subject of speculation and to some secrecy as well. And it's partly because he was doing his utmost to prevent a personality cult, but also, who knows, there may have been other secrets in there. It was about 2 decades ago, I think, in the 80s, 90s, when finally a wife emerged. Most people knew about her already. I mean, there aren't that many secrets in Cuba. And so she has now become much more a public figure. That's to say, people know about her, they know that she's there. His first wife actually is an emigre. She left Cuba in the early 60s. And indeed, one of her relatives is one of the most ardently anti-Castro politicians in the United States. So that's what we know for sure. Who knows who else there might have been in between?